Hello, and welcome to this video where we're going to talk about the part of the process from the signed LOI to the closed transaction. After you sign an LOI with your preferred buyer, you're going to go under exclusivity and you're going to enter into a period called due diligence and then ultimately closing. In this video, we're going to walk through the key steps and items that you need to focus on in order to get from signed LOI to closed deal. We're going to talk about what's the purpose of due diligence. We'll talk about very key negotiations that you need to keep focused on when you're doing the purchase agreement. We'll talk about something called the disclosure schedule process. And then finally, we'll talk about what I like to call the last mile or getting your transaction closed. Let's start with due diligence. Most people think that due diligence is sort of like a fact-finding, unpleasant, kind of annoying process to go through. And while it certainly can be that, I want to take a half a step back and talk about what's the true purpose of due diligence when it's done correctly. And it's a little bit broader than what you might think. The first thing is the part that's traditionally thought about where the buyer is going to be trying to validate key business and legal facts about your company. They'll look at financials, they'll look at suppliers, other commercial terms, and basically making sure that what they think that they're buying and what we've said that they're buying is accurate. In addition to that, they're going to be undergoing a complete risk and compliance assessment test on the business where they want to dig deeper into it, specifically with the focus on what risks or things could happen to this company that would damage the company and make this a bad investment. But beyond that, there's a couple of operational and business purposes to it that if you really embrace these, the due diligence process can go smoother for you. The buyer's also just trying to learn as much as possible about what makes this business run and what makes it be successful. And the more that you can have interactive dialogue with them regarding that, it not only builds confidence in them, but again, assuming that you're going to have some contingent payments on some level or rolled equity, it helps them be smarter about your business right when they need to be, which is when they own it. And then finally, it allows them to start project planning out at the next level of detail what resources and capabilities are going to be needed to successfully integrate the business within their overall larger company so that there's a smooth transition, not just on the ownership side, but on the operational side to avoid what I would lovingly call a hiccup in the business. And obviously, nobody wants to lose that momentum, least of all the buyer, but second least of all you if you have any payments related to the future performance of the business. So if you see due diligence in this light, you'll see it as part fact-finding, but part collaboration toward a common goal. And I really encourage you to take that approach. In terms of how to go through it, we've talked previously about the due diligence work streams that are out there. And just to repeat, I think it's a great idea to start building your data room folder well in advance of even contemplating a transaction. Simply put, if eventually you're going to need to structure your business along these 5 categories that you see and 19 subcategories, why not start storing all of your information in that environment so that you're ready to go when it comes time to look at exiting? The 5 areas that we typically separate it in is the general business section, the supplier section, which is often carved out just because it's so important for e-commerce sellers, your legal section, your financial section, and then employees oftentimes we carve out because there's a certain set of HR or documents or those things that you want to make sure that you're dealing with on a separate basis than the general business topics. Having your data room built out will save you time as well so that you can continue to focus on the deal and running the company. And then there's going to be a part of due diligence, which I call preparing for the buyer interviews or buyer meetings. And ask your advisor. We actually put out something called a how to handle a buyer due diligence meeting checklist. So it gives you an understanding of how to go through the process. And we also encourage asking buyers to send you any questions in advance under the notion of we'd like to be as efficient as we can on the call. Some buyers, frankly, like to ask it to you in real time and not provide that because they want to see how you react. But from a sell side perspective, I always like to, quote unquote, know the questions in advance. Okay, there's some key negotiations that are going to be going on after you go through the due diligence or sometimes alongside of it that you want to keep your eye on the ball. The key points are There's a lot to be negotiated after you sign an LOI. Most sellers that we work with have no idea the amount of ongoing negotiation that happens between an LOI and a close. We'll usually have somewhere between 30 or 40 open items, and our strategy is to negotiate every one of them to try and protect you as best as possible as a seller. So don't think that just because you've got an LOI in hand that you've got a deal done. There's a lot of negotiating left. Remember, however, not to lose focus on the due diligence side and the running of the business side, because if you want your business to succeed and get through the close, you've got to keep the performance up. So you want to work with your deal and your legal and tax leads to highlight and discuss the key negotiation points. And whenever we work with a seller, we don't have them go through the details of the 90-page purchase agreement itself. We always bring to the table on a call what's called an issues list. So you should always ask for an issues list to be circulated in advance of the calls so that you can hear what the core issues are, not in legalese, but in actual English that you can understand. You're going to be faced with this a lot. When do I walk and when do I compromise? And of course, we can't give you any specific advice on that. That's unique to your situation, but we can give you some guidelines. Typically, compromising is when it's not a material or key or a deal breaker item to you, or even if it is very important, but what the buyer is asking for is close to what the market standard would be. You want to consider walking a little bit more when the buyer starts to show a lack of willingness to negotiate a market agreement, meaning they want you to always be seeing things their way, and or you have just a fundamental agreement on a business point. But at a certain point, you start to get a notion that if it's this hard to get a deal done and they're not thinking of my perspective, what happens if there's a problem after the closing? Are we just going to be at each other's throats, so to speak? Okay, now we're going to shift from the purchase agreement to something called the disclosure schedules. And how do you reduce your liability risk through disclosure schedules and additional covenants in your agreement? Simply put, there's something out there called representations and warranties that I like to think of as the promises. There are ones that are almost always going to be fundamental promises, as you can see here. You've got organization. Did you have the authority to do the deal? Do you have any conflicts, or have you paid your taxes? And then there's going to be things that are almost always what are called general reps, and we'll explain that in a little bit, which are a little bit more like the minor ones that are out there. Did I have my employee contracts in place? Other types of things like that. And then there's ones in the middle that are sort of sometimes can lean toward fundamental and sometimes they'll lean toward general reps. The key point is this. If it's a fundamental representation of the business, that means that it's sort of core to the company. The liability for you is literally up to 100% of the amount that you've been paid. I'll give you an example. Is if you didn't have the authority to do the deal because there was another shareholder that you needed approval on and you didn't get it, you sell your company for $5 million. The other shareholder sues and gets an injunction on the buyer, and the buyer loses $5 million because they bought something that's worthless. They can come back after you for the full $5 million. Okay. And if you did something fraudulently, a lot of times it's unlimited. So if they lost 10 million, they could even come back to you for more than that. However, if you have a claim that is a general rep and warranty, it is not 100% of the purchase price, but it's generally between 5 and 30% of the purchase price, depending on the size of your deal. Shortly put, the bigger deal, the smaller the percentage. So let's just say you had an employee matter where you had an employee that found out that you sold, and then they sued the buyer and said, hey, I'm actually owed a bonus for $3 million, but you did a deal for $5 million. They would only be able to come back to you. Let's say that you settled on a 20% cap on a $5 million purchase. Your maximum exposure is $1 million. It doesn't matter what the lawsuit is for. Your maximum exposure is set by the cap. Then there's going to be things called a basket. And the basket is a low-level threshold of if it's below this amount, don't bother me. So in a $5 million deal, if we set the cap of the basket at 1%, it would be take $5 million multiplied times 1% equals 50,000. So if there's a claim out there for $20,000 because an employee had a bonus coming to them, the buyer can't even bring the claim because it wasn't big enough to matter. And then there's the time period. If you notice, it's 3 to 6 years or the statute of limitations in the fundamentals, and it's a much shorter time period in the general reps. So when we're negotiating a transaction, we always want to be thinking about two things. One is, what are we actually representing or promising? And two, what bucket does it fit under? Because that tells us what our exposure is. Beyond the reps and warranties side, there are some key things you're going to want to negotiate, primarily confidentiality, making sure the transaction is confidential for the buyer, a non-compete, which is typically 2 to 4 years in length, and that you won't compete against the definition of the business. It's very important to negotiate that as narrow as possible. And a non-solicit, which means that you can't go around stealing the employees of the buyer for a period of time. Okay, now that you've got an understanding of reps and warranties in general, let's get more specific about how they actually work and what the power is in their ability to reduce your liability risk. Here's what the process looks like. As we said, a rep and warranty is a fancy legal word for a promise that you're making. And I'm going to give you an example. You've promised that no supplier has communicated a desire to increase product costs. But actually, you have had that happen. What you do is you fill out something in the disclosure schedule. So in Reps and Warranties section 3.10, you are asked to represent that no supplier has ever said that they're going to increase pricing. You go into the back of the document, of the legal document, into something called the disclosure schedules, and you say, as it relates to section 3.10, where I'm saying that nobody has communicated a desire to increase prices, that is not fully true because there was an exception to the promise, which is that my supplier B indicated that they intended to raise prices by 15% in the next month, and it's going to result in an estimated $50,000 increase in my annual supplier costs if I don't change prices to the consumer. Okay, here's the key step of what happens. The buyer, because you've now disclosed this, gets to make a choice. They can either say to you that they're going to change the deal and say, hey, we're going to have to drop this deal by a 5 multiple on that 50,000 or $250,000. Or if they don't do that, the buyer cannot come back after you and make a claim later. And you get what I refer to as, if you know the old Monopoly game, a get out of jail free card. The key point of this is that it encourages you not to hide from the buyer, but to over disclose, if anything, because every time you make a disclosure, you reduce your liability because the buyer can no longer come after you regarding that claim. With one key point is if down in the lower right-hand corner, they sometimes will create what's called a special indemnification clause. So if you said, I haven't paid my sales taxes in Florida for the past 2 years, for example, and I think I have an exposure for $200,000, they're going to come back to you and say, oh, well, we're going to create a special indemnity that if there's any losses regarding that, that falls outside of the normal process or cap on indemnification. So the key point to doing disclosures is that there's an art to this where you want to disclose as absolutely much as possible, but also recognize that you don't want to be caught to where you want to have special indemnifications out there. Okay, once you understand that, you can really find a way to mitigating your risk in a transaction. So you want to work with your advisory team and say, hey, what are all the disclosures that I need to make that will protect me so that a buyer can't come back to me later after the sale if there is a claim? The last step is the last mile of getting your transaction closed. And believe me, it is not a straight mile. It's an uphill climb, it's a windy road, and there's no guardrails as you're going up the mountain, so it's easy to fall off. Regardless of how smooth your deal has been up to this point, you will almost always feel like there's 2 to 3 times that your deal is lost. When that happens and you start to feel a deal getting off track and you need to get it back on track, You have to have the business teams communicate and work through as many issues as they possibly can before bringing it to the legal teams to write it. Many a deal has been killed by over-aggressive lawyers not listening to the business people and creating so many scare tactics out there that somebody backs out of a deal that they should have done. Your job as the CEO and the deal lead, in charge of the deal lead, is to keep two things going. One is your business running smoothly. And then the second is to reinforce to all of your teams, unless you're walking away, you reinforce loudly that we are closing. If you had to ask in all of the years that we've been doing transactions here at Northbound, what has probably been the one thing that I would point to that's been our success in helping sellers, I would probably point to this last point. We simply do not give up on a deal unless it absolutely makes sense to do so. And you work 24 hours, 7 days a week, whatever it is to do, because closing is the only thing going forward. Or, as Gene Kranz said in the Apollo 13 movie when he discussed a real big challenge of getting a damaged spacecraft back to Earth, failure is not an option. We're at the last slide here of this particular last section of a deal. Congratulations. When you close your transaction, and I don't want to use the word if, when you close your transaction, you will likely have become a part of the 1%, or even more likely, the 0.1% of business owners that have successfully built and exited a business. So consider yourself in rare company and take a bow. After signing an LOI, to recap, you're going into an intense process of due diligence and negotiating your final deal with your buyer. You need to both focus on closing the deal, but remember to continue operating the business as normal, because failure to do so can result in a decline in the performance and jeopardize the closing. And always remember, at the end of this thrilling and nerve-wracking journey is a closed transaction that's going to put you in the top 1% of business owners and likely give you more financial freedom than you've ever experienced in your life before. Thanks for being on this journey, and we look forward to helping you close your life-changing freedom exit. Thank you.